All right. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Stoffel, and I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Sherry Buffington as co-presenters and co-hosts of this program called ABCs of Emotional Intelligence and Leadership Development. Pleased to introduce Sherry. She is a 30 plus years of experience in motivational and performance psychologist. Has written several books and is a speaker, presenter, and developer of multiple leadership programs, sales programs, customer service programs, and so forth. So it's always a pleasure to share the stage with her because she's a 20 plus year friend, coach, mentor of mine, teacher of mine. And so I'm always honored to share the stage with her. My name is Kevin Stoffel. I'm the owner of a small business called Strong People Systems. I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and I do training, coaching, consulting around leadership development and talent screening. And so I'm pleased to be here with you guys as well.
And I am delighted to always be working with you, Kevin, because I don't know of anyone who is more giving and more willing to serve than you are.
Well, as I often sign my emails, here to serve. That's my purpose in life is to serve other people. So
And you're very good at doing that too.
with that, so we call this program the ABCs of emotional intelligence because we see these as the foundational building blocks of these two topics, emotional intelligence and leadership development. And the ABC stands for awareness, better choices, and caring. So if we expand those three things, that's where all true leadership begins, with leading ourselves well. As we become aware, we make better choices, and we do so with a caring approach. Um, that's leading ourselves well. That's where all leadership starts, is leading ourselves, because we're the hardest person in the world to lead is ourselves, because we oftentimes have a hard time getting out of our own way. And uh, those three things really go to this model that Sherry developed years ago called the ACE effect, which everything starts with awareness. The more we can expand our awareness of the options and the choices that we have in front of us, the better choices we can make. And life is a binary code, as this visual represents here, is that as we become aware of the choices that we have to make, we can do one of two things. We can do the right thing, or we can do the wrong thing, or we can um, not do the right thing, or not do the wrong thing. And every time we make a choice, whether we do the right thing or don't do the wrong thing, it has an effect on our energy. And we can feel it can have a positive effect on our energy, where our energy goes up and increases and improves and gives us more motivation and drive and enthusiasm and performance. Or it can have a negative effect on our energy, where it drains us, our batteries, and puts us into a dark space or negative space, and we can feel our energy go down. And so the effect on our energy, we can feel it go up, we can feel it go down, or we can feel it being in kind of a stuck pattern. So it really life just comes down to a series of choices of doing the right things, or not doing the wrong things. And sometimes, like I said, not doing the wrong things is just as important as doing the right things.
It is the right choice, right? It also, besides just affecting your energy and how you think, it affects your outcomes. Every single outcome that you will ever have follows this process, every one of them. And the more you can expand your awareness, the better choices you can make. And the better your choices, the more likely it is that you'll get the effect you're after.
Right. And the caring piece is always important. And I think as well, because um, caring about the effect that our choices have on ourselves, but also the effect that our choices have on other people, because our choices and decisions affect ourselves and others, and we can have a positive effect or a negative effect on the people that we interact with, or that are part of our sphere of influence. So that I think caring, making choices that care for ourselves as well as care for other people is hugely important on that effect as well. So what is emotional intelligence? It's really the ability to effectively recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions, and to recognize, understand, and effectively influence the emotions of others. So as Plato said, above all else, know thyself. So it's really about authentic self-awareness, and the awareness and motivators and needs and communication styles of others is essential to developing a high level of emotional intelligence. Because the more we become aware, understand, accept, and be kind towards ourselves, the more we can become aware, understand, and accept, and be kind towards others. And when we're kind towards ourselves and kind towards others, that develops better relationships, better relationships develop better teamwork. Better teamwork develops, greater outcomes or, greater achievement of our goals, in life and in business.
And this factor is vitally important for good communication because we can't communicate well if we don't understand ourselves, our own communication style, and if we don't understand the person that we're trying to communicate with. And what emotional intelligence does is puts us in a space of being assertive rather than going into the aggressive, pushy space or the passive, letting people walk all over us space. So that's emotional intelligence is a really important factor when it comes to, well, everything, but certainly communication is that's a factor there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of emotional intelligence. One of the things I think about too is ultimately really its goal is kind of a win-win situation rather than a win-lose um, kind of scenario. And the more we can create a win-win situation, the greater outcomes that we can achieve. Because there's very little in this world that we can achieve by ourselves because we have to interact with employees, with customers, with prospects, with vendors, as business leaders. But in even in personal life, we have to interact with spouses and significant others, children and parents and friends and family and so forth. And so, anytime we can create a win-win situation in any of those dynamics, it's better off for ourselves and people that we're involved with. So this program we've been doing now since about February or March, I think is when we started it. So there's really kind of a roadmap of what we have covered and plan to cover. We started back in the relationship building process, starting with motivation, and worked through those bullet points of influence, assertiveness, integrity, dependability, decisiveness, self-leadership. And now we're on the topic of effective communication. And then in the future, next 3 months, we'll be covering problem solving, change management, and vision delegation. So if you didn't participate in those first 6 or 7 sessions, they're out on YouTube. So you can go out, do a search for the ABCs of Emotional Intelligence Leadership Development. You can find the recordings of those sessions. So we encourage people to go out and listen to those. And we encourage you to join us for future sessions as well, because we really think that participation in these live sessions is highly valuable, not only to you, but to other audience members, because your involvement, your participation with your questions, your thoughts really adds significant value to the conversation. It's more than just sharing the slides. So we encourage everybody to listen to previous sessions and join us for future sessions. So Sherry, you want to kind of lay out where we're going?
Yeah, we're starting with looking at effective communication, and it's a two-way street. Part of that begins with active listening, staying present and paying attention to what the communicator is trying to communicate, giving feedback. Many people fail to give feedback. We notice if we're attending to nonverbals, we notice nonverbal feedback more frequently than we ever get verbal feedback. But it's really important, especially when you're giving instructions to someone, that you get feedback. Because if we assume people are listening and they're not, you're not going to get the outcome you're after. So feedback, when you feedback from your perspective too. We'll talk more about that later, but you never want to, do you understand is not feedback. Almost everybody will say yes, even if they don't. I want you to tell me what I just explained to you so I understand that I know that you understand is not a way to get feedback either, because that sets up resistance. That makes the other person think that you think they're stupid. So if you keep it in your court, please feed back to me what I just explained to you so that I know that I shared that well is good feedback. Matching a communication style. If we are attending to other people, if we're noticing what they're telling us, people tell the absolute truth non-verbally. And if we're paying attention, they're telling us all kinds of things without a single word. And if we're paying attention, we can know, are we connecting with them? Is there rapport? Are they listening? Are they distracted? What's going on? And there are lots of elements, lots of levels to communication that we can match if we learn if we know what we're looking for. So we're going to be covering those multiple levels of communication. And when you look at it, you're going to be going, I'll never remember all that. But we're at the end, we're going to get you down to a simple thing that you can always do to at least get you started down that pathway. And again, that feedback is from your space, remembering to always use iMessages. Please feedback what I explained so I know that I communicated what I intended.
Right. And the active listening really talks to you managing your thoughts and what you're attending to. And as you kind of see by the pictures there, the one next to the red X, clearly the guy is not listening. He's paying attention to his phone rather than listening to what she's trying to explain to him or communicate to him. It's a very different signal or message that he's sending, and his nonverbal feedback versus the two guys next to the green check mark, where they're actually paying attention to each other and trying to actively trying to understand what the other one is trying to communicate. So those are two very different examples of active listening versus being distracted by something else. So we always need to manage our thoughts and what we're attending to. Be present in the moment, be present in the conversation.
If you've ever been in a restaurant, it happens a lot these days. It's really fascinating. And you see, just the other day, I was in a restaurant and there was a couple sitting at a table just close by. And they were both on their phones. They were not talking to each other. They were both on their phones. I don't know if they were sending private messages to each other or what was happening, but neither of them were looking at each other or talking to each other.
Any comments or thoughts on those three topics?
Yeah, I saw a great meme the other day. It was a sign at the beach and it said, pretend it's 1975 and talk to each other.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah, very, very true. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it has its negative effects as well, and distracting us from being present with the person that we're interacting with, communicating with is one of those negative side effects.
Yeah, the last comment I'll make is I really support the third, using the I statements. That's one of the things we teach in Mankind Project. It's because the you always starts to trigger the internal shame. Mm-hmm. And once I trigger shame, our chances of having an effective conversation are gone. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, shame, any negative emotion, but our emotions, once they get hijacked by things like shame, we are hijacked. We are, incapable of really listening or being open to what's being communicated to us once we're emotionally hijacked, because now we're in defense mode, in some, or preservation mode in some way, shape, or form. And emotional hijacking is huge.
Another fascinating thing happens is when we are emotionally hijacked, when you're using you messages to get feedback, even if the person wants to give you effective feedback, they're shut down. I mean, they're now in emotional space, not cognitive space. And what they perceived cognitively is not being communicated right now because it's not the space they're in the moment.
Yeah, they can barely hear the words you're saying at that point, or interpret the words that you're saying. It's just kind of, the words just kind of become blah 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 because I'm emotionally hijacked and I'm thinking about my emotions and the feelings that I'm going through. It's kind of like the Charlie Brown wah 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 wah.
So on this slide, we're looking at the many ways that we need to be attending to in order to match communication styles. So there are sensory preferences. If you're listening to language, you recognize that people tend to use particular analogies or phrases to let you know how they're accessing information. So there's visual. Visual people say things like, I see what you mean. That's a visual response. Auditory people who are predominantly auditory will say, I hear you. Yeah, or that sounds about right. Right. they're using auditory words. Kinesthetic people use things like that seems right or that doesn't feel right, or because at the kinesthetic level, communicationally, kinesthesia is about touch. But there are two kinds of touch. There's physical touch and there's emotional touch. And so what they're in communication, it's always emotional touch. So what they're communicating when they're communicating that doesn't feel right. That's a kinesthetic approach. So understanding if we can mismatch, if we're using auditory language, for example, and the person's least preferred communication style is auditory, we're miscommunicating. We're not connecting. Motivation, moving toward pleasure or away from pain. If you're talking to someone who is motivated by moving toward pleasure and you're talking about consequences, this is the pain that's going to occur if you don't, they're not hearing that. They're not motivated by that. And the opposite is true. If you're talking to someone who's motivated by moving toward pleasure, possibility, and gaining things, or who's motivated by avoiding pain, and you're talking to them about pleasure, they're not going to hear you either, because you're telling them about all the wonderful things that are going to happen if they do this kind of thing. That doesn't motivate them. They're motivated by avoiding pain. So listen for that too. Is their language telling you that they are moving toward pleasure or that they're avoiding pain? And your language needs to match that. The way you motivate them needs to match what motivates them. Then there's direct versus indirect communication. Direct communicators say exactly what they mean, where indirect communicators throw out clues, and you're supposed to gather up the clues and come to a conclusion. And the way those two kinds of people miscommunicate is the indirect communicators throwing out clues and the direct communicators not looking for them, or the direct communicators giving you direct information and the indirect communicators looking for clues and there aren't any. And so those two miscommunicate for that reason too. So a direct communicator tends to talk about facts and figures, and they're in logical space all the time, where indirect communicators throw out a lot of analogies and examples, and it's again, you're supposed to hear that analogy, or you're supposed to take that example and use it as a clue to come to a conclusion. So that's how those two communicate differently. Verbal and nonverbal alignment. If what someone says to you verbally does not align with what they're showing you nonverbally, almost everybody, in fact, I don't know of anybody that's an exception, goes with the nonverbal versus the verbal. So if I say to you, oh, I'm really so excited, you're not going to believe that I'm excited, because my nonverbal communication, that my voice tone, my body posture, my facial features, nothing about what I just did in alignment with those words matched. So we always go with the nonverbal if there's a mismatch between those two. And it's really knowing that we tell our absolute truth nonverbally. When I train people on the core profile, I teach them to see what people express nonverbally. And we're always doing that, whether we think we are or not. So you can walk into it. Carmel can do that. Kevin can do that because they've been trained to do that. Walk into a room of 100 people and tell about 95 of them what they are. Can you not? Yeah. And the reason you can't do the 5 is because the 5 are so conditioned that they don't express anything. They're just non-expressive. That 5% are too non-expressive to read. But if there's any verbal communication, if most people tell you exactly who they are, and when you know who they are, you can then know what's behind who they are, and then you can also know how to communicate with them, what they need communicationally. We're going to cover those here in a little bit. So then there are behavioral preferences. And we'll cover this in more detail. So introverts communicate differently than extroverts do. Thinking styles communicate differently than feeling styles do. Sensors communicate differently than intuitives. And we're going to look at all of those. And so again, you look at this slide and you're going, oh my gosh, that's a lot to remember. So if you look at this slide here at the bottom, the 4 people where somebody's holding up a sign that says no, all of those are saying no. But 3 of them are saying no non-verbally, and only 1 saying no verbally. But if you know to read those signals, you know that all of them are saying no, stop, don't come any further, right? So again, a lot of layers to attend to, and it seems overwhelming until you recognize that people will tell you exactly where to go and exactly how to communicate with them if you're listening.
Yeah.
And
And
attend.
when I think about all these things, there's none of them that are right or wrong, right? They're just different.
Right.
And it's not about changing who you are, because we all have preferences of these, ourselves and wiring, that relate to ourselves. It's not about changing who you are, but it's about learning to speak a second language, right? So if you're talking, if I'm, English speaker, native English speaker, if I move to Germany, I need to learn to speak German, right, to effectively communicate with those people. Or if I move to France, I should learn to, speak French to effectively communicate with the French people. And so we need to meet people where they live, right? And not, but that doesn't change that I'm still a native English speaker, but I feel like I have the obligation to learn to speak a second language to be able to effectively communicate based on where the other person is coming from if I'm moving into their space. So it's not about changing who you are, it's about learning to speak a second language and meeting people where they live.
Before we leave this slide, let's play with this. So Cindy, looking at the sensory preferences, do you know what your sensory preference is?
I would probably say the kinesthetic.
Yeah. So I used to think I was visual, but I take notes all the time. And even if I never read those notes again, I take notes. And it's because I'm kinesthetic. I'm kinesthetic first and visual second, right? And it took me a while to realize, well, I take all these notes not because I'm ever going to read them again, but it helps me remember that kinesthetic application.
Same,
Do you do that?
same. I do that all the time.
And how about you, Titus? What's your dominant sensory preference?
Note taking and not reading, yeah, kinesthetic.
Okay. How about you, Carmel?
I have boxes and boxes of notes I've never looked at a second time. An entire file cabinets full of them, probably.
Yeah. Kevin, what is it? I think you told me this is.
I lead with visual. I'm a terrible note taker. I learned in college that if I just went to class and listened and saw what the teacher was presenting, so visual and combination of visual and auditory, I could do really well in the class without being a great note taker. People I would ask to borrow other people's notes, so I could read what they took down, see what they took down. But nobody ever asked me to borrow my notes because my notes were always terrible. It's like they would be hurting to rely on my notes from class if they missed class kind of thing.
And he just used a visual term. So I could read what they put down, see what they put down, right? He just used a visual term. So knowing that we're what your style is, you can know that you're going to hear, those of you who are kinesthetic are going to hear kinesthetic words, language better. So your kinesthetic people tend to be more looking for a feeling kind of conversation. So they want to connect. They want that feeling connection. And it's that saying that I need to know what what is that? I need to know how much you care before I care how much you know. And kinesthetic people tend to, that tends to be true for them. They need to know how much you care before they care how much you know.
And we tend to take a lot of stuff personally.
Yes, yes.
Even if it's intended otherwise, I have to really check myself. Am I taking this personally all the time?
Right. Yeah, very true. Very true. I can remember when I was doing a lot of live presentations, and I would ask for feedback. I would put out a paper so people could give me feedback on the program. And if I had 30 people in the room and 28 of them said, this was amazing, it's changed my life, this was awesome, but 2 people had criticisms. It was those 2 criticisms that was the most impactful. Yeah, yes, you're right. We definitely tend to take things personally. So motivation. I suspect that most of you leaders tend to move toward as opposed to away from, but do you? So let's talk about that. Cindy, do you move toward pleasure or away from pain?
I would say, that's a good question. A little column A, little column B on that one.
Okay. So, but there's still a preference for one over the other. It might not be a strong preference, but there'd be a preference for one over the other. Clearly, we
I think moving toward pleasure, I move away from pain when I have to.
Yeah,
because
right, exactly.
I don't like to be in pain. But,
Right.
yeah.
But in conversation, if I wanted to motivate you, would you be more motivated if I'm talking about the things you can get and achieve, right? Versus the consequences if you don't do. Which would
Yeah, moving toward pleasure, yeah.
Okay. How about you, Titus?
Terms, yeah, moving toward pleasure, I think.
Okay. Carmel?
I'd say based on results, occasionally towards pain, but we're going to say towards pleasure as an average, as the more function.
And of course, that's what the brain, all motivation is moving away from pain or toward pleasure, but we have a preference for one over the other. And our preference is what's going to motivate us. The language that feeds that preference is what will motivate us.
And fear level. I know when I'm in a high level of fear, I'll get more combative, more resistant, more aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm feeling safe and secure, then I'm more present and I'm less reactionary.
Right. And that's a good observation too, Carmel, because in fear, if your preference is to move toward pleasure, fear is pain. That's interpreted by the subconscious mind as pain. And so if you go into that combative space, what you're doing is fighting the need to move away from pain. You're fighting that need. In the other space, when you're in that good space, when you're moving toward pleasure, you're not fighting. You don't need to fight. You're doing what feels right to you. And so when you get combative, recognize that is your subconscious mind going, no, this is the wrong end of the spectrum. And you're fighting the pain, moving away from pain. The direct versus indirect communicators. How do you communicate, Cindy? Are you a direct communicator, or do you look for and give clues?
Direct.
Okay. How about you, Titus?
Direct, for sure.
Carmel?
I think that's what you described earlier as a slight preference, and the preference would be direct.
Okay.
And I can be very indirect.
It's that secondary entertainer piece. I'm kind of close to that middle line too. How about you, Kevin?
I would say direct. I don't like guessing what people mean. I like to.
Yeah. No, I don't like guessing either, but I'm guilty at times of throwing out analogies. I do that sometimes. So I usually do that when they're just not connecting, when people aren't connecting to direct communication. And it's one of the adjustments we need to make as communicators. If someone is not connecting with you as a direct communicator, recognize you're going to have to come up with an analogy. You're going to have to come up with an example. You're going to have to give them something that is non-direct for a non-direct communicator to hear you. Because if they're looking for clues and you're not giving any, they're not hearing you. They feel you're being cold and uncalculating, and you don't care to connect. So they're not listening. So let's move on to the others, and we'll talk about those when we get to those, because there's a lot of information about these other parts.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that. So with Core Map, we're looking at CORE stands for Commander, Entertainer, Relator, and Organizer, and those are 4 primary core types. We're born with those or with our core nature, we will die with it. Conditioning can suppress it, conditioning can enhance it, but in either case, we have a preference for one of these four styles. And these four styles communicate differently. So if we're looking at commander and entertainer, those are the two extroverts. And so they communicate as an extrovert communicates. And you can see both of them have the same bullet points there. They think out loud, they process externally, they fill in the silence. They don't like silence. They say, they say what they feel or what they're thinking, and then they let go of it. And they're wondering why the people who don't communicate that way are still nursing that wound hours later. They don't get it. What happened to you? Why are you acting that way? Right? They're still nursing a wound that you've just moved on from past. They focus on the commander. The difference between commander and entertainers: commander is more logical. They're a thinking style, so they're focusing on information, where entertainer is a feeling style and is focusing on the feelings. That's the one that wants to have that feeling connection before they're listening to the logic. So the purpose for commander to communicate is to just share knowledge. They feel if I tell you what you need to hear, if I give you that information, that's sufficient. The purpose of communication is to share knowledge, period. That's what commanders believe. Entertainers are in that feeling style place, and they believe that you have to be connected emotionally as well as sharing information. So just sharing information isn't sufficient for them. Same thing for relators. Sharing information is not sufficient. They need you to connect on a feeling level too. They want, again, I need to know how much you care before I care how much you know.
That's what I was just going to say is that statement, that phrase is hugely important to entertainers and relators.
And relators, right.
You got to care first before I care about your knowledge.
Right. And so then we look at the introverted styles. That's organizer and relator. They do not process externally. They process internally, and they don't. They need to process the information before they share it with you. And what often happens when you have extroverts communicating with introverts is the extrovert asks the question of an introvert, and because they believe that a response equals intelligence. So an example of response versus an answer: if you ask an extrovert a question, they're going to respond immediately. They're not going to answer you immediately necessarily, but they're going to respond immediately. So you ask a question, if they don't know the answer, they'll go, well, I'm not quite sure. Let me think about that. Let me see. Well, I'll have to think about it a little bit. I'll get back to you. That's a response. It's a non-answer, but it's a response. Where an introvert isn't going to do that. You ask them a question and they go inside and they start processing. And what often happens is an extrovert, because they don't want the silence there, they think that they think silence means you either didn't hear them or you don't understand. And so they'll either rephrase the question or they'll repeat what they just said. They'll do something to fill the silence, something to reconnect with you. And what that does to the introvert, the introverted thinker, is it aggravates them. Now they're frustrated because you are not giving them the space to think, to process the information, and you've just shut them down. And so I see this happening in business meetings all the time. The bold people in a meeting are talking and they're brainstorming. And by the way, introverts hate brainstorming. That's overwhelming to them. But they'll be brainstorming, and they'll if they bother to ask an introvert at all, they'll ask them a question, and if that question isn't answered quickly, some other extrovert in the room is going to fill in the space. And so all that knowledge and all that wisdom that those introverts probably have never gets shared. So it's important as leaders, especially in meetings where you have a mixed group of people, to inform your people, especially the bold types, to just be silent and give the introverts time to process that information so they can share it.
Some of the best insights and best wisdom comes from the introverts because they are thinking things through before they speak. But their wisdom and insights never get the benefit of it because you never give them the time to process and to share those insights and those wisdom. So it gets lost forever, which is a terrible shame, if you will.
And another problem that we often see in teams and groups is the thinking styles, both commander and organizer, think that sharing information is sufficient. If I tell you what I mean you to hear, if I give you the information, that's sufficient. Where the feeling styles, you're just not connecting with them. They feel like, in fact, you'll often hear complaints from the feeling styles, mostly entertainer because they're bolder than relator. But they'll complain about a boss who they say, they just aren't very caring, or they don't have much, they don't care about their people, when in fact they might care very much about their people. It's just how they're communicating.
Yeah. My younger daughter in high school, she came home from her school one day and she said, I don't know, the teachers don't care about me, Dad. They, to them, I'm just a number. She said, why should I care about their homework if they don't care about me as a person? That was a classic, description of from an entertainer. She's an entertainer personality style. It was a classic description of, she said, why should I care about their homework assignments and doing them on time? They don't care about me as a person. That happens in business all the time as well. Why should I care about your request, of what you want from me as an employee if you don't care about me as a person?
Mhm. So on top of the introvert extrovert thinking feeling differences, there's the sensing and the intuition. So intuitives tend to be generalists. They think in broad terms. So commanders are big picture people. Entertainers are all over the board. They see and process everything. So they're big picture people. Both of them are. Where the sensing types are specific. They look at specifics. And if that's the Swiss cheese I was just talking about earlier. If a generalist communicates with from that big picture space, again, it's Swiss cheese communication, lots of holes there. And so this kind of communication with the two thinking styles, direct, not trying to connect, the feeling styles will back off. And because they're conflict avoidant, they back off, and you're not getting from them what you need, not verbally or emotionally. And like Kevin's example earlier, if you don't care about me, why should I care about you? Why should, it's that cognitive bias of reciprocation. So we tend to reciprocate, we tend to want to give what we get. And if you don't care about me, why should I care about you? That's the cognitive bias of reciprocation. And so if you don't want that to occur, then if you happen to know that you are a direct communicator, meaning you're probably a thinking style, at least you communicate as a thinking style, that you're going to be shutting people down if you're not also connecting with them. So I use the term, if you look at specifists, it comes up as a misspelling. It's a term I use because in the same way that there are generalists, there are specifists, and they want specifics. Don't tell me it's about 3 o'clock. I want to know precisely what time it is. About 3 o'clock isn't good enough. A generalist will say about 3 o'clock. A specifist will say 3:10 or 3:03 or whatever. They'll give you specifics. And they're looking for them, and they give them. So the disconnect there is that generalists are impatient with specifics, and specifists won't move forward without specifics. So if you're giving Swiss cheese kinds of communications to a specifist, someone who's an organizer or a relator, especially an organizer, will do nothing because their dominant need is to get things right. And if they don't have enough specifics to know that they can get things right, they are not going to do anything. They would rather do nothing than something wrong. And so if you're giving an instruction and you're not getting feedback, which you should be, but if you aren't, and that specifist is asking you questions, be patient to fill in those holes because they won't move forward without those holes filled in. Comments, questions here?
I think where this is landing for me lately, and a lot of the challenges I've been experiencing are dealing with customer service. I am so tired of people lacking this understanding when I ask for specific agreements and specific commitments, and I get one and it's rarely, if ever, honored. My trust in that company is gone. And I will switch companies because they lack the understanding of how to communicate to me, the customer. And like Kevin was saying about the teacher and the student and the homework, I'm the same thing. You make a promise to me and you don't keep it, you get one more chance, and then we know what happens next. So yeah, I think it's really, really key. I've run into a lot of this summer, and I've changed a lot of companies I do business with.
I'm working with a company that uses a lot of contractors, and they run into that all the time. They say they will go through 10 to 15 contractors before they find one that works with them that well. It's like, how do you put yourself out there as an expert if you can't produce what you're promising?
Yeah, and the underlying message that's sent, if they're talking about communication, is I'm not of value.
Exactly, and that may not be what they're actually intending. Obviously, isn't what they're intending, but that tells you that a couple of things are happening. They're not listening. They're not getting enough feedback from you. And even if you're offering feedback without them asking for it, they're not listening. And they're communicating in their way, not yours.
And what I'm finding too is they're subject to policy instead of integrity and thinking.
Yeah.
Well, if it doesn't say that in the book, I don't know how to answer you.
Right.
Well, close the damn book and listen to what I asked you.
Or we've always done it that way. It's like the story about the cutting off the end of the ham. Why did you do that? Well, grandma did that. Why did she do it? I don't know. Her mother did that. So, why do you keep doing things the same way? Well, we've always done it that way. Doesn't make it right. Yeah, good point.
Another key component of effective communication is including the why. Why are you asking somebody to do this? What's the reasoning behind what you're trying to communicate? Because when we include the why, it does several things. It reduces resistance. So people are more willing to comply when they know why they should, right? If there's no reason, then they come up with their own excuses as to why not. It increases the buy-in. People are more willing to listen to those who share the reason for taking action. And then increase independent action, which kind of goes to what Carmel says. If it's not in the book or in the policy, they don't know what to do because they don't understand the intent behind what you've asked them to do. So they're not empowered to think for themselves because they don't know the meaning or the reasoning behind what the policy was intended to do. So why is hugely important to promoting and empowering people to think for themselves. So when you communicate something and they go off to try to do it, and they run into a problem, if they don't know the why, they can't think and take independent action. They got to come back to you for further clarification. It's like, well, I went off to do this and I ran into this problem. What do you want me to do, boss? And that's very inefficient or ineffective. They're not empowered to be independent thinkers and problem solvers. And and also the why makes the effort worthwhile. Challenges are less likely to derail the goal. People understand the why, the intention, the purpose behind what you're trying to achieve.
There was a study done probably 15 years ago, but the study was to see how compliant people would or would not be. It was looking for compliance. And they would go into stores or people standing in line for a movie theater or just people in line, and they would try to cut the line, cut in. So they would step in. So they would say, "Do you mind if I cut in?" And 95% of the time, people say no. And they added one little piece to that. Do you mind if I cut in because? And it didn't matter how stupid the reason was, if they gave a reason why they needed to cut in, it increased the odds of people saying yes by a couple 100%. You know, where 95% would say no, now only about 20% would say no if they just gave it because, and it could just be because I'm really in a hurry. It could be something like that. It was just adding because and giving a reason increased the odds of them getting a yes by many times.
Yeah. And I often think about this topic as well, relative to, the number one question that I think we ask as kids is why? Why, mommy? Why do we do it that way? Or why, daddy? Why do I need to do that? Why do I need to brush my teeth before bed? Right? Or whatever the question, the question in the kid's mind is. That's the number one question, is why. And that question never, gets conditioned out of us because parents and teachers and so forth and bosses get tired of answering the question. So it gets, we maybe stop asking the question, but the question never goes away. I think it's part of our nature to always want to understand the why behind what we're being asked to do. So the question never goes away. So we got to assume that it's there. So we need to assume that we need to include the why in our instructions or in our communication to be effective in that communication and to get effective buy-in, to reduce resistance and promote and empower independent thinking and independent action and problem solving. We always should include the why. All right, so boiling it down to our action steps. Sherry, you want to cover these?
Sure. And our ABCs, we always do an ABC of action steps. Observe nonverbal cues and gestures, and here's where you can start in order to attend to the other factors. So people tell you their absolute truth nonverbally, and you can use nonverbals like a target. So the broadest thing that we can see is gestures. The way people use their hands, the way they move, their posture. Gestures is one form, and people tell you where they are right now in the moment, non-verbally, if you're paying attention. People can control their gestures, can and do, especially if they're aware of that you're reading their gestures. They're less able to control their facial expressions. They're less aware of facial expressions. So be attentive to what's happening in the face. And if you're really aware, you're paying attention to the eyes also, because they'll tell you all kinds of things with their eyes. So for example, where they're accessing information, they'll tell you that with their eyes. And even if they know, if they're staring right at you and you're paying attention to what their eyes are doing, we have zero control over our eyes. Even if we think we're controlling them, we're not. So if I ask you a question that requires you to give me an answer, you're going to access information with your eyes, even if you just do it briefly, even if it's just a brief jerk, we can see what they're doing. So looking at the behavioral preferences, visual people tend to access up. They tend to access high. They'll look up. They'll look up to the left or up to the right, depending on whether they're accessing the past or the future. Auditory styles tend to access right at ear level. So they're looking pretty much at their ears. That's where their eyes access. Feeling styles access down. They're looking down. And interesting, a lot of people misconstrue how feeling styles access because they'll see people looking down and they read it as dishonest. And it's not dishonest at all. They're just accessing their feelings. And you can even notice that in yourself. There are times. So an experiment that I've done in workshops before is to ask someone to tell me about the last vacation you took. Tell me what was really fun about the last vacation. The most enjoyable vacation you ever took. What was that? They'll almost always access something visual. because we recall visually, usually. And you can see them accessing the past visually. And then you say, tell me the last time that you spent a significant moment with your mother, right? And they'll invariably look down because they're accessing an emotion, the connection to their mother. So those are things that, again, we have no control over our eyes. When you're noticing nonverbal communications, notice gestures, notice posture. Are they leaning forward? Are they leaning back? Are they, are they closed to you? Are they open? And that's their arms and legs will tell you that. Are their facial expressions telling you? And by the way, facial expressions, introverts are much harder to read than extroverts. Extroverts are very expressive, so they use an entire face to express, which is another way you can tell whether you're dealing with an introvert and extrovert. So Kevin leads with entertainer, which is a feeling style. Carmel, do you lead with entertainer? Yeah. So they lead with entertainer, and they have really expressive faces. And so when they do an expression, you see it all over their face. Commanders, I lead with commander, and I use from my eyes up. It's mostly in the upper part of the face, the brow, the eyebrows or the forehead, right? So if you're noticing someone who's gesturing from the eyes up, you're probably dealing with a commander, a thinking style, a bold thinker. If you're looking at people who are easily expressive, you're dealing with a bold feeling type entertainer. If you're looking at non-expressive, low expressive, and not only are they low expressive with their facial features, they're also low expressive in their voice tone. So extroverts tend to be, there's a lot of inflection in their voice for the bold types. Commander and entertainer use a lot of inflection. The introverted types don't. That's very monotone. It's very even language. So you don't see a lot of inflection or you don't hear a lot of inflection. So you can even tell over the phone whether you're dealing with an introvert or an extrovert. Just listening at the tone and the inflection. Extroverts tend to talk louder, introverts tend to talk softer. Extroverts have more inflection, introverts have less. Same thing with facial expression. And so when you're looking at nonverbals and you're recognizing that they're telling their absolute truth nonverbally, and then you can listen to the words and see how they're choosing to tell you their truth, or how they're choosing to communicate what they're trying to communicate in the moment. Now you can look at the other factors too. Where are they coming from? So then you want to be sure that you give and get feedback using iMessages. So if you're not getting feedback, if someone, say for example, you have a superior who's giving you instructions, or you have a vendor who's giving you instructions, and they're not asking you for feedback, give it. Say, let me see if I understand this. Let me feedback to you what I think I just heard, and to see if I get it, if I understand it right. Right. So you're asking for feedback if they're not giving it, because it's so important to in communication to make sure you connect, that you give and get feedback. And many people don't ask for it. Many people don't ask for it.
Right. And effective communication doesn't happen unless understanding happens. Right. If there's no understanding, there's really no communication. You can
Right.
say all the right words and convey the right message, but if it doesn't land with the other person, they don't understand your intent or your meaning or your purpose, there's really no effective communication happening, even though you said all the right words.
See there is to listen to their language so you know how to adjust yours. And that's really important, because we can't drag people into our space. They're not going to come willingly. We have to go into their space and connect with them in the world they live in, and then gently bring them back into our world. We can at some point communicate more in a way that's more comfortable once we are connected to them, once they can hear us, once they can connect with us. But we have to be the one responsible for the adjustment, especially as a leader. As a leader, you are always responsible for the communications. You're always responsible for whether or not your people understand what you intend for them to understand.
And that goes back to my example of if I move to Germany, it's my responsibility to learn their language, to effectively communicate with them. Same is true in communication, in general. It's my responsibility as a leader to meet them where they live, not expect them to learn my language because I came into their space.
Yeah, I was in Mexico years ago, and a street vendor came up to me and he asked me in Spanish, "Do you speak Spanish?" And I answered in Spanish, "Muy poco," very little. He said in English, "When you're in Mexico, you should know some Spanish." And he was right. When you're in Mexico, you should know some Spanish. I learned one word that I knew I needed to know quickly. I went back to my room and learned it, demasiado. And demasiado in Spanish means too much. So when you have lots of street vendors approaching you all the time, you need to know too much. So fortunately their no is our no too, so I at least knew that much. But yes, it's our duty to go to where they live and meet them there. Questions, comments?
Comment. We talk about in the first part of observing gestures. One of the tools I learned a long time ago in observing gestures is if I pick up on one of your gestures and I use it, I've established a rapport that they're even unaware of really increased rapport. And matter of fact, I got a couple jobs from doing that. And the president of the company asked me what he thought my chances were of getting the position. And I said 95%. And he said, "Well, how do you get that?" And I said, "Well, remember when you made this gesture and I followed you, and then you made another gesture and I followed you, and then I did this gesture and you followed me? I had you."
Yeah, that mirroring. Good point. That's a really good point, Carmel,
And
because that's a really good way to know whether you have rapport with somebody.
so then his immediate question was, or I asked him, I said, "So what are my chances of getting this job?" And he said, "About 95%. So I knew I was in.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that because that's a really good way to know whether you're connected with somebody or not. Is just to mirror them. You mirror their behaviors, and what you just described was beautiful. At some point, you purposefully created a pose that he followed. Yeah, awesome. I like that. Any other comments? Anything what you want to share?
Great
Communicating
reminder,
across-
really putting it in bite-sized pieces. I'm really enjoying the way you guys have laid this out.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's a lot to, when you're looking at communication, like I said, I'm just wrapping up the book called What Cheese, but there's just so many levels that people get overwhelmed with it if they don't understand that you can back it down, right? And begin somewhere. You begin somewhere, and the best place to begin is non-verbally, because we tell the truth there.
Yeah, most employee surveys, inside businesses and organizations, the number one challenge is always communication. Effective communication is huge inside of organization, and it's so lacking because there are so many layers and it has so many complexities to it. But you can boil it down to something simple like we've done. You can be much more effective.
Yeah, there's a quote that a friend of mine shared that it's a Buckminster Fuller quote about what is the single most important tool created for our industrialized civilization. And most people think of a tool in terms of a mechanism or a powered component. And the answer is language.
Yeah. George Bernard Shaw said, "The biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place." So yeah, we definitely step into that illusion. You should be understanding what I just said to you because I spoke it in English and you speak English. You should know what I'm saying.
Well, all right. So this is a quick slide on an overview of our LEAP program, Leadership Equipped to Actualize Potential. So if your organization or if you know of an organization that individuals that would benefit from Leadership development, we encourage you to share that with us. We'd love to talk to you about that program, where we dive into some of the beyond the skills and the knowledge into some of the strategic factors relative to exceptional performance and productivity.
And if you have any questions concerning communication, we're going to be covering problem solving next month. But if in communication you run into something, contact us. You can contact me or you can contact Kevin. Either one of us are more than happy to talk to you offline. Problem solving is another big topic for leaders. Is, how do you solve the problem? Well, you start that by communicating well, right? You can solve a lot of problems by communicating well. But we're going to cover all the other things that people run into and the reasons people don't move into problem solving mode. That will be October 9th. So we'll see you back there.
All right.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We've got a number of people that we're going to send this out to that register but don't show up. So
And I got a few people I can talk to that would be interested. So I'll be sharing it in the interim.